The MCAT Cars Podcast, session number 67. The Cars section of the MCAT gives thousands of pre-meds nightmares every night. Whether you're an ESL student, lack confidence while reading, or a slow reader like me, Jack Weston and the medical school headquarters are here to help you score higher in every section so you can be confident you're ready to get the MCAT score of your dreams. Welcome to the MCAT Cars Podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, and if this is your first time joining us here on the MCAT Cars Podcast, thank you, and welcome to what will hopefully be an amazing free resource for you to increase your car score and increase your MCAT score overall. I'm joined, of course, by none other than Jack Weston, the premier MCAT Cars tutor online. You can find him at jackweston.com. Check out everything that he has to offer. As this podcast is coming out, he has a new course starting up right around the corner that you should check out. It starts February 27th, 2020. If you're listening to this in the future, you can go to jackweston.com and click on courses and see when the next one starts. If you need more personalized help with your cars section and your cars understanding, go to jackweston.com, check out the course. He does free weekly trial sessions as well if you haven't checked out how Jack Weston teaches his course, if you need a little bit of extra love there as well. If the course is still open, he does limit the seats so that it can be more personalized. If the course is still open, you're ready to rock. Go to medicalschoolhq.net/Jack Weston. That's medicalschoolhq.net/Jack Weston to save $100 off on your course. That is an affiliate link. I do get a little beer money when you sign up using that link, but I would appreciate it if this podcast has been helpful for you, if I've been helpful for you at any point. It is a coupon that will activate as soon as you use that link. Again, medicalschoolhq.net/Jack Weston. You can also text the word MCAT Cars to 44222. Again, that's MCAT Cars to 44222. And that'll give you a link to that coupon code as well. Again, that's MCAT Cars, all one word, to 44222. Let's go ahead and jump into our article today. Jack Weston back for some more MCAT Cars podcasts in this new year. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Ryan?
I'm great. Jack, the MCATs, as we're releasing this podcast, it's February, start of the year, everybody ramping up for medical school applications, and with that comes a whole slew of students getting ready to take the MCAT again. Have you seen over the course of the last year or so, have you seen any big trends getting feedback from students who have taken your course? Any big trends and changes in the cars section of the MCAT, or things kind of status quo?
I've mentioned this to many students over the years. The test changes every year. It doesn't change in terms of its format every year. That happens every 10 years, right? Like the scaling changed in 2015. They added a new section to the test in 2015. But they always change this test, and they change it towards critical thinking. So it's become a more critical thinking, reasoning, logical-based exam, and that goes the same for the sciences as well. The physical section, the bio section, it's always becoming more cars-like. So, and I joke with students, it's really Cars 2.0, right? The other section. So, yes, I mean, this is happening all the time, every year, and the reason why is because it's a standardized test. So they implement new questions every year, and they test out how they do on them, and then they add it to the next year's pool of questions. And there's a constant editing of these questions, a constant just an addition or removal of questions based on the data they receive from students that take the tests. And that's very intriguing for many students. Like, they find that very interesting how that all works. But I really wouldn't focus on that at all. I would just focus on understanding what you're reading, being able to use the information you have to answer questions. Aside from that, you shouldn't really worry about how the test changes. It shouldn't make you nervous or anxious. Just Your job will not change from one exam to the next. You just have to do what you're responsible for, which is understanding the ideas the authors present, whether it's in science passage or a cars passage, and answer questions based on them.
Let's talk about this for a second. We haven't talked about it in a while, and it's a question that comes up all the time. Is how do I best prepare for the car section? Obviously, listen to this podcast and go check out your free daily cars passages. But in terms of articles to read or books to read, students are really interested in that type of material. What do you typically recommend for students?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there are a couple ways to approach it. Depends on who you are. So there is a couple of categories of students that this can cater to. So I'll start with the freshmen in college, right? Just starting off, kind of worried about cars. If you're a freshman in college, or you're a year or two out of taking the test, you just need to practice. Just read every day, right? Looking at text every day can alter your brain. It does. It truly does. It changes the way you perceive other people, society, how you understand ideas. Just read every day. Now, if you're close to taking the exam, then what I recommend is using the CARS passages from the AAMC and really dissecting them, really analyze them, because they show you how the test really works. You don't have the luxury of doing a million passages. Well, I'm exaggerating, but hundreds of passages up until your test date, because that's something that you should be doing over a course of a year or two. And I always tell students, if you can start early, because CARS is really a habitual kind of natural inclination that you build over time. But that doesn't mean you can't build it quickly within a couple months. You just have to be more specific in the resources you use to really capture its essence. Now, the other category of students that I always help, and they love the course and they love how I teach because it's very systematic and they love that kind of system, are science-oriented students, right? And science-oriented students just don't like reading, and even if I tell them read a year out or a couple months out, they just don't want to do it, right? And for them, I would say it really comes down to accepting the test, right? Not avoiding it. Just accept that you have to do it. It's not practice oriented. It's not like you have to just study every day. It's a mental shift. So you have to get around the fact that you have to read these passages, right? If you're science oriented and you just don't like reading. And the other category that I like to address is ESL. So if you're English as a second language, usually these students not only aren't used to reading, right? They just find English as a secondary thing to how they think and how they like interact with their family and friends, but it is something that they find as sort of a nerve-wracking, daunting task, right? To read and write stuff. So this is more of a confidence issue, not a deliberate kind of like, I don't want to do this kind of mentality. It's just confidence that seeps into how they read and answer questions. So to address the confidence issue, I would look at vocabulary words, because usually if you're an ESL student, you're not very comfortable with different words. And if you see a word you don't like, it's going to throw you off. It's going to totally mess with the way you read and answer questions. You're going to doubt yourself throughout the whole thing. So it just depends on who you are, but I hopefully addressed almost everyone, right? Whether you're new to this, whether you've been whether you're about to take the test, whether you're essentially just someone who's science oriented and just doesn't want to read, you have to really get around that by shifting your attitude towards this test. Attitude is huge. And then ultimately, if you're an ESL student, you have to get around the vocabulary words, because I promise you, this is not a vocab test. This is a test that is universally applicable to anyone. So whether you're, someone from the Middle East or someone from Asia, we all speak the same language. We all have the same, kind of desires and thoughts and beliefs. So if you can connect with the author and not worry about the exact words the author uses, you'll get over this test pretty, easily or fairly easily. So yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our article today and see how bad my reading has gotten over the new year.
Yeah, I think you'll be okay.
What do we have today?
So today's passage is a really helpful one in terms of referencing to time. A lot of authors like to use time to discuss their ideas, whether something happened before or after an event. Time plays a big factor in how the authors use their emotions to describe ideas. So for instance, if something happened before a war or after a war, their attitudes may shift. So keeping track of time is very important on the MCAT in terms of reading CARS passages.
All righty. All right. Again, if you want to follow along, link in the show notes, the description in the podcast app that you're listening, or on the website if you're listening on the website. First paragraph. I first read Slaughterhouse-Five in 1972, 3 years after it was published and 3 years before I published my own first novel. All right. So here's this time that you were talking about, right? We have a year, and then 3 years after it was published. So just quick math, 1969 was when it was published, and 3 years before this author wrote his or her own book, which was 1975.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of students will read this sentence and go, huh? What?
Yeah.
Right? But as long as you know 1972, I think you're okay.
Yeah. Okay. So really no judgment on the book. It's just straightforward. I read this book and I also have my own book. All right.
Right.
I was 25 years old. All right. So now we're anchored with an age of the author. 1972 was the year of inching slowly toward the Paris Peace Accords, which were supposed to end the war in Vietnam, though the final ignominious American withdrawal, the helicopters airlifting people from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon, would not take place until 3 years later, at which point, by way of a small footnote to history, I had become a published author. Oh, all right. So we have this really, really long sentence, which for most people is hard. Again, for ESL students, but maybe particularly hard. So the author is kind of giving us a little history lesson about what was going on in this period. 25 years old, the Paris Peace Accords, the Vietnam War. Yeah. So 3 years later, the author mentions in the first sentence that 3 years later, he or she was an author after reading this book. And also 3 years later, finally, people were being airlifted from the embassy in Saigon.
Yeah, very good reference to time.
Oh.
You understand the placement of everything, which is, I think, important because it gets you closer to the author's kind of feeling, attitude, emotion.
Yeah.
Okay.
It helps. And I guess it would help the author. It helps me understand the author's point of view and perspective a little bit more, knowing what was going around him or her at the time.
Right. And you see this word, right? This ignominious vocabulary word.
Yeah.
It sounds like a spelling bee word, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of times, like I said, ESL students will read this and focus on it and go, oh, I don't know what that word means.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't matter. You don't need to know that exact word to get the idea that we're talking about Vietnam War, right?
Yep.
So you're okay if you don't know what that word means. I mean, it essentially means
I have no idea what it means.
Yeah, like humiliating or kind of just basically embarrassing.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Next paragraph. I mentioned Vietnam because although Slaughterhouse-Five is a book about the Second World War, Vietnam is also a presence in its pages. And people's feelings about Vietnam have a good deal to do with the novel's huge success. All right, so we're given some good information here about Slaughterhouse-Five, which was brought up in the first paragraph, what it's about. It's about the Second World War. It looks like it also has a little bit of Vietnam in here. And the author is saying that the book was a huge success, partly because of Vietnam, the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, so basically you have to understand that the book is about World War II, but the feelings that we had during Vietnam played a role in its success because people felt the war, right, another war, and maybe they resonated with the book because they were, experiencing a war themselves at that time. Okay, go ahead.
8 years earlier, in 1961, Joseph Heller had published Catch-22, and President John F. Kennedy began the escalation of the United States' involvement in the conflict in Vietnam. All right, so more timeline stuff. So I'm trying to figure out, right, 61, okay, it's before Slaughterhouse-Five. It's giving me more people, more books, more stuff, right?
Right. Okay.
Oh.
Now we're also discussing 1961, so I would keep that in mind.
Yep. Okay. Catch-22, like Slaughterhouse-Five, was a novel about the Second World War that caught the imagination of readers who were thinking a lot about another war. All right, so again, another book about a war, and people were interested in it because of what was going on in Vietnam.
Okay.
In those days, I was living in Britain, which did not send soldiers to fight in Indochina, but whose government did support the American war effort. And so, when I was at university and afterward, I too was involved with thinking about and protesting against that war. So this was a very interesting thing. We've talked about this a bunch, that you've talked about how authors like to switch words kind of in the middle of a passage, and you're supposed to just kind of tie them together. So here we've been talking about Vietnam, and now all of a sudden the author uses Indochina, and I guess we're supposed to say, oh, it's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Ooh.
Yeah, more or less, right?
Yeah.
It's in Asia, so yeah, exactly. Okay. So it's tough because you may be thinking, oh, I have to know these different ways of understanding things. Not really. You just have to go with it, right? And be sharp when you see these kinds of changes.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to mess up if you think it's Indochina and not Vietnam, right? If you just separate the two and you see them as distinct things, you're fine. It's not going to affect you that much right now unless the argument revolves around this. But for now, it's just giving us more of a historical kind of description. So if they do care about it, they'll probably be a lot more precise. They'll say it in a way where you visualize the same thing, but they use different words to capture that visualization.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
The author, again, giving us a little bit of perspective about who he or she is and where they were at the time. So being in Britain, not necessarily super involved in the war, but supporting the war, at least the country was, and being a university student protesting the war.
Sounds good.
I did not read Catch-22 in 1961 because I was only 14 years old. All right, so more timeline stuff here. So 1961 is when the book came out, and the author was 14 years old. As a matter of fact, I read both Slaughterhouse-Five and Catch-22 in the same year, a decade later, and the two books together had a great effect on my young mind. All right, so the author here letting us know that they've read both books in the year, both influential on him or her.
Yes. Now, can you tell me overall, after reading these two paragraphs, what do you have to know? What is the author trying to describe here?
The author is describing. So I want to say directly, if I were to go super literal, right? I think you teach like just read what is being told. The author is saying that there were these two books that were very influential in his or her life, being surrounded by the Vietnam War.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. So they're about the other war, but the Vietnam War had something to do with their success and even the author's interpretation of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. Next paragraph. It hadn't occurred to me until I read them that anti-war novels could be funny as well as serious. Okay, so the author, a little spin here. So going from just talking about the seriousness of war and the books and everything else, and now the author is saying, hey, these could be funny.
Yeah, and notice it actually describes them as anti-war novels.
Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't read these books, at least now you know they're probably against war, anti-war.
Yep.
Okay?
Catch-22 is a crazy funny, slapstick funny. So just describing that book, he or she thinks it's funny, slapstick and crazy funny. It sees war as insane and the desire to escape combat as the only sane position. All right, so just more description of Catch-22. Its tone of voice is deadpan farce. So here's another one where I think a student who wants to know every word in every sentence and every phrase is going to get caught up. Like, deadpan farce, what does that mean? Oh my God. I have no idea what that means, but I'm just going to keep reading.
Well, let's think. How has the author described it so far?
So funny.
Funny, crazy funny.
Crazy
right?
funny.
That's something I understand.
Yeah.
Slapstick funny, what does that mean? That's not a term we use these days, right? That's like for like older kinds of movies and sketches and whatever, right?
More physical kind of funny stuff.
Right. So exactly. So in this case, if you're not sure what slapstick funny is, don't worry about it. You already know what crazy funny is, right?
Yep.
It's just chaotic funny.
Mm-hmm.
You can probably assume deadpan farce is associated or related to crazy funny, and you'll be okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Slaughterhouse-Five is different. So just comparing or contrasting the two books. There's much comedy in it, as there was in everything Kurt Vonnegut wrote, but it does not see war as farcical. So a comparison here between the two books. So in the previous sentence, or one of the previous sentences, the author describes Catch-22 as a farce, right? Deadpan farce. And then in this sentence, the author is saying that Slaughterhouse-Five was not a farce. So big difference there. It sees war as a tragedy so great that perhaps only the mask of comedy allows one to look it in the eye. So just a different view there. Vonnegut is a sad-faced comedian. Interesting. I don't know what that means.
What it does mention sad,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we've been talking about Slaughterhouse-Five in this tragic kind of way. So I can start understanding this in a more depressing mood, right? Compared to Catch-22. Now, it's not saying it's not funny. There's still funny tied to it, but it's a different kind of funny. Go ahead.
Okay. If Heller was Charlie Chaplin, then Vonnegut was Buster Keaton. All right, so I know Charlie Chaplin, right? He was the silent film funny guy.
Yeah, he's like the definition of slapstick
exactly.
Comedy, right?
But for a student who may not know these names, I don't know Buster Keaton. I'm just gonna go, I don't know. Hopefully I don't need to know specifics. I just know Heller, Catch-22, crazy funny, Vonnegut, sad-faced comedian.
Yeah, so we can probably assume Charlie Chaplin is what? Crazy funny.
Mm-hmm.
And Buster Keaton is probably what?
Sad-faced comedian.
That's it. So don't worry about not knowing the history behind this, because I promise you almost no one who reads these articles in our era knows exactly who Buster Keaton is. Maybe you do, great, but I would say a majority of people or students, especially the younger generation, don't know who Buster Keaton is, and that's totally fine. Or even Charlie Chaplin, and that's okay too.
Yep. His predominant tone of voice is melancholy, the tone of voice of a man who has been present for a great horror and lived to tell the tale. All right, so it's interesting here that the author using this word melancholy, which a lot of students may not understand, but then he defines it, or she defines it right after, right? Being present for a great horror and living through it. So you can kind of picture what someone may look like in that setting.
Exactly. I always tell students who attend my trial session or you sign up for my course, visualize. Try to picture the scenery, right? I can see who this person is, who wrote it, how they felt as they wrote it, right? That's really important. Okay, go ahead.
The two books do, however, have this in common. They are both portraits of a world that has lost its mind, in which children are sent out to do men's work and die. All right, so big twist here at the end. Nice serious tone with comparing the two books, right? The whole paragraph has been contrasting the two books, but the very last sentence here is comparing them, saying they're similar in that they are portraying this crazy world, lost its mind, and painting this picture of kids going out and dying in war.
Yeah, so it's hard to do, but you have to kind of see both books in terms of comedy, right? And different kinds of comedy, but also seriousness, right? There's a serious element to it. So it's, that kind of picture that you're painting for yourself is reading. And if you can do that well, regardless of what you read, you're going to be fine when you get to the questions. That's why a lot of students actually enjoy cars, because you don't need background knowledge on any of this stuff in order to do well. Sure, you should know the historical timeline. You should know World War II came before Vietnam War, and just understand general history of civilization. But aside from that, you don't have to have read these books. You don't have to know any of these authors or characters that they're referring to. It's just in the text. So as long as you don't bring in your bias and you stick to exactly what's being said, you're going to be fine when you get to the questions.
Okay. Next paragraph. As a prisoner of war, age 22, which is to say 3 years younger than I was when I read his story, von Gutt was in the famously beautiful city of Dresden, locked up with other Americans in Schleinpfafenf, where pigs had been slaughtered before the war, and was therefore an accidental witness to one of the greatest slaughters of human beings in history, the firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945, which flattened the whole city and killed almost everyone in it. All right, so now we're given a little bit of background on von Gutt, who was described in the previous paragraph as this melancholy person, right? Witnessed or was present for great horror and lived to tell the tale, and that's exactly what it was.
Good. So it's expanding on which book right now?
Slaughterhouse-Five.
That's important to know.
Yep.
Right. The author seems to be emphasizing one book over the other at this point.
Okay.
Okay, good.
So it goes. Nice little short paragraph there. I had not remembered until I reread Slaughterhouse-Five that the famous phrase, "so it goes," is used only and always as a comment on death. So the author pointing out a very specific part of the book, this phrase, "so it goes," which the author of Slaughterhouse-Five, von Gutt, is using to portray death or comment on death.
Okay.
Sometimes a phrase from a novel or a play or a film can catch the imagination so powerfully, even when misquoted, that it lifts off from the page and acquires an independent life of its own. So it sounds like the author here is trying to say that "so it goes" is saying that phrase kind of took on a life of its own outside of how von Gutt was using it in the book.
Yes, exactly. So people may be using it in a different context.
More cultural kind of usage of it. Okay.
Yeah, and it even says when misquoted. So it doesn't have to be in reference to what von Gutt wrote. Go ahead.
Okay. "Come up and see me sometime," and "play it again, Sam," are misquotations of this type. So the author giving examples of other misquotes, I don't know what they're referring to, but I guess they wouldn't be important. They're just examples.
Exactly. So other kind of phrases that have functioned the same way.
Mhm. Something of this sort has also happened to the phrase, so it goes. So the author here focused still on so it goes, and what happened to it. The trouble is that when this kind of liftoff happens to a phrase, its original context is lost. So again, this author focusing on so it goes, this liftoff, so using it outside of its original meaning, the author is saying that people don't understand the original context, where it came from.
And that makes sense because we've been
Mm-hmm.
talking about misquotations, right? And so you can kind of think of it as being used for different references.
Yep. I suspect that many people who have not read Von Gut are familiar with the phrase, but they, and also I suspect many people who have read Von Gut, think of it as a kind of resigned commentary on life. Which makes sense, right? So it goes, right? Well, oh well, so it goes, right? It's like Eeyore. Picture Eeyore saying it.
Right.
So the author here is saying people who have read Von Gut, who haven't read Von Gut, kind of think of it in potentially a similar way, but still.
No, yeah, I want to make something clear. It says resigned commentary on life.
Correct.
A lot of times students will read this and go, what does that mean? Right? So you have to visualize that. Like I said earlier, visualization is helpful. If you resign from a position, you're basically giving up, right? You've decided, I don't want to do this anymore. So when you resign on life, commentary on life, basically you've given up on life. You just go with the flow. You do whatever happens, essentially.
Mhm.
Okay?
Life rarely turns out in the way the living hope for, and so it goes has become one of the ways in which we verbally shrug our shoulders and accept what life gives us. All right, so the author here really painting a good picture of how we use this phrase, so it goes, in our culture now, which is different than how it was originally used in the book.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to ask you that. Is this how you think Von Gut expected you to understand so it goes?
Mm-mm.
Probably not. Exactly. Okay, go ahead.
But that is not its purpose in Slaughterhouse-Five. All right, so the author here stating that. So it goes is not a way of accepting life, but rather of facing death. Okay, so it goes is the author is saying, hey, Von Gut wanted us to face death with this phrase. It occurs in the text almost every single time someone dies, and only when death is evoked. All right. So this one is all about a very specific phrase in the book, so it goes, and how it's used in the book and how we use it differently in culture.
Cool. Okay. What do you think the main idea of this passage is? What is the author really trying to convey once you read this article?
Oh man. So a lot of it is about these two books, but then there's a switch and focus mostly on Slaughterhouse-Five and just how there's this big focus on death, right? This whole phrase, so it goes, this big focus on death, and really about this author who faced a lot of trauma during the war and potentially where that sadness comes from, the melancholy comes from in the book.
Exactly. I like to look at Carr's passages kind of like as a fruit basket, right? You have a bunch of different fruits, apples, bananas, oranges, etc. Right?
Can it be an edible arrangement?
It really is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can't just paint one picture for the entire passage. There are different layers, there are different levels to a passage. And the only way you're going to capture all of those different fruits or levels is by just reading every paragraph. So when students come up to me and ask me, hey, can I just read the first paragraph and the last paragraph, or the first sentence and the last sentence of every paragraph? That doesn't work because you're not going to paint the big picture of this passage well, or at least understand that picture by just reading a couple of paragraphs or a couple of sentences. You only can do that if you read the whole thing. So I highly advise you, before you get to any questions for Cars, read the passage first. Don't do the questions until you read the passage, because you're going to have to end up rereading the questions if you read them first. And you're not going to really have a good understanding of the questions anyways. Even when you read them first, you're not going to really know what it's referring to. So if you can read for these different layers, right? First layer being how the books kind of were popular during Vietnam War, right? And how that kind of impacted its popularity. You can understand the idea that these books shaped the author's perspective on life and everything in the future, right? Understanding the differences between Catch-22 and Slaughterhouse-Five, right? They're both comedies, but in a different way. One is more crazy kind of comedy. The other one is more kind of like a tragic kind of comedy. Now, you may not know exactly what a tragic comedy is, but that's okay. As long as you know there's a difference between the two and you know what crazy kind of comedy is, you'll be able to at least know enough to get to the questions, right? Just understand that the book is sad, right? It's more sad than crazy. And ultimately, it's about death, right? That's the whole last paragraph. It's Slaughterhouse-Five is about death. So if you know these different layers before you get to the questions, you're going to get every question right. Because what can they test you on? You know everything. You've read everything, right? So yeah, I mean, just remember, it's not just one thing that you're looking out for. It's multiple things. Ultimately, those things add up to be the main idea, which is all about Slaughterhouse-Five and basically how it's a comedy, it's sad, it faces death. Those are the things that kept coming up over and over again. Anti-war, right? These are things you should definitely know when you get to the questions. You don't have to have, you didn't have to have to read Slaughterhouse-Five. You could have never heard of it before in your life and you would have been fine. But if you're not paying attention, you're not concentrating on the author's position, on how the author perceives these things, especially with reference to time, you may get lost and you may get focused on the wrong things, like words that don't really matter, right? That just paints a better picture for you, but you don't have to have that huge picture to do well. You just need those different layers. And if you have a good idea of those layers, you'll be okay.
All right, so there you have it. It's another great episode. Again, if you are not following along in kind of the recommended way where you actually read the passage first, go through it, and then listen to the episode, you are probably not getting as much out of this podcast as you can. Obviously, anything will help, but the better use of it, right? Practice as best as you can, and it will improve your score. Again, if you want to check out Jack Weston's CARS course, you can text the word MCAT CARS to 44222, and we'll give you a link with that discount code activated. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT CARS podcast.
This is MedEd Media.